The Cleveland Torso murder, also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, was an unidentified serial killer who terrorized the Cleveland, Ohio area during the 1930s. The killer's crime took place between 1935 and 1938 and involved a series of gruesome murders, with the victims often dismembered and decapitated. The case remains one of the most baffling and unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The killer targeted drifters, prostitutes, and individuals on the fringes of society, making it difficult for law enforcement to identify patterns or potential victims. Most of the victims were male, and the murderer usually dismembered their bodies, often leaving them in gruesome display. Some victims were decapitated, and their heads were never found. The murders occurred in the Run area, a shanty town on the outskirts of Cleveland, where many homeless individuals lived during the Great Depression. The killer seemed familiar with the area, choosing locations that were secluded and difficult to access. The Cleveland Torso murders case presented numerous challenges for investigators. The lack of heads made identification difficult, and the killer seemed to have a deep knowledge of forensic techniques, as there was little evidence left behind. Additionally, the victims' transient lifestyles made it challenging to establish connections or motives. Despite extensive investigations, the police were unable to identify a definite suspect. Several individuals were considered persons of interest, but there was not enough evidence to link any one particular individual conclusively to the crimes. The lack of clear motive further complicated the search for a perpetrator. Elliot Ness, famous for leading the Untouchables during Prohibition, became Cleveland's safety director in 1935 and took a personal interest, in solving the Torso murder case. However, despite his efforts and the formation of a special task force, the killer was never apprehended. The Cleveland Torso case has left a lasting legacy, capturing the interest of true crimes enthusiasts, historians, and investigators. Various theories and speculation surrounded the identity of the killer, ranging from a lone psychopath to theories involving organized crime and corruption. The Cleveland Torso murder case remains unsolved to this day, and the lack of concrete evidence, the passage of time, and the mysterious nature of the killer's identity have contributed to the enduring mystery surrounding this gruesome case. Despite the passage of many decades, the Cleveland Torso murder case continues to be a topic of speculation and intrigue, and it remains one of the most perplexing unsolved mysteries in the history of American crime. The Cleveland Torso murder claimed the lives of at least 12 victims between 1935 and 1938. Due to the transient and often marginalized nature of the victims, information about their personal lives is limited. Additionally, the victims' identities were further complicated by the fact that many were never officially identified due to the absence of heads in some cases. Here's a brief overview of some of the known victims. Edward Andrassy, found in Kingsbury Run on September 3rd, 1935. He was a male aged approximately 28 years old. Andrassy's body was decapitated and his head was never found. John Doe 1 was found on February 23rd, 1936. He was a male, approximately 40 years old. Like Andrassy, this victim's head was also missing. John Doe number 2 was discovered on June 5th, 1936. He was a male, approximately aged 20. His head was found, but was never officially connected to the body. Florence Geneviève Polillo, who was found January 26, 1937, officially a female of 42 years. Polillo was one of the few victims who was identified. She was not decapitated, but she was emasculated. John Doe number 3, discovered on September 10, 1937. He was a male victim aged approximately 20 years old. The victim's head was found separately from the body. Jane Doe number 1, possibly Rose Wallace. This body was found on the 23rd of February 1938 and was identified as a female approximately 30 years old. Like many other of the victims, this victim was decapitated and her head was never located. Jane Doe number 2, discovered on June 6, 1938, was a female aged approximately 40 years old. This victim's head was found, but not officially connected to the body. The victims often were referred as unknowns due to the lack of positive identification. Were part of a series of brutal and gruesome murders attributed to the Cleveland Torso murder. The transient and marginalized nature of the victims made it challenging for authorities to establish connections or motives to their crimes. The lack of identification and brutality of the murders contributed to the mystique surrounding the case, which to this day remains unsolved. The Cleveland Torso murder case remains one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. Over the years, several individuals were considered as potential suspects. The lack of concrete evidence and the mysterious nature of the crimes has made it challenging to identify the true perpetrator. Here are some of the notable suspects associated with the Cleveland Torso murder case. Frank Donzel. Donzel, a bricklayer, was a suspect due to his proximity to some of the crime scenes. He committed suicide, unfortunately, in 1939, and some speculated that he might have been the Torso murderer. Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. Sweeney, a former physician, was considered a suspect after Eliot Ness received a series of taunting letters, allegedly from the killer. Sweeney had a history of mental health issues and was questioned by Ness. However, there was insufficient evidence to link him conclusively to the murders. Severed head letter writer. The killer, or someone claiming to be the killer, sent several taunting letters to the media, law enforcement agents, and other individuals, often including details about the murders. Some suspected that the writer might have been actually the perpetrator, while others believed it could be an elaborate hoax. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Some investigators theorize that the torso murderer might be involved in medical affairs or have knowledge or surgical skills due to the precision with which the victims were dismembered. This led to speculations about a doctor or someone with anatomical expertise being responsible. Frank Sweeney, no relation to Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a suspect who was considered due to his criminal history and connections to the Kingsbury Run area. However, like many others, he was not definitively linked to the crimes. Various transient suspects. Given that many victims were drifters or individuals on the fringes of society, law enforcement considered the possibility that the killer was also a transient person, making identification and apprehension much more challenging. Despite the attention and investigations, none of the suspects mentioned here were definitively linked to the Cleveland torso murder, and the case to this day remains unsolved. The lack of forensic technology at the time and the absence of a clear motive have contributed to the enduring mystery surrounding the identity of the killer. The Cleveland torso murder case continues to be a topic of fascination and speculation among the true crime enthusiasts and historians. The Cleveland torso murder case presented numerous challenges for investigators, and the lack of concrete evidence contributed to the difficulty of solving the crimes. The killer was meticulous in avoiding leaving behind traces that could lead to their identification. Nevertheless, here is a summary of just some of the evidence and notable aspects of the investigation. Crime scene details. The murders occurred in and around the Kingsbury Run area, a shanty town on the outskirts of Cleveland. The secluded locations chosen by the killer made it challenging for investigators to find witnesses or gather evidence. Victim profiles. The victims were often drifters, prostitutes, or individuals on the fringes of society, making it difficult to establish connections between them or discern a clear motive for the murders. Dismemberment and decapitation. The killer consistently dismembered and, in some cases, decapitated the victims. The precision of the dismemberment suggested a certain level of anatomical knowledge or surgical skill, leading to speculation about the perpetrator's background. Taunton letters. Elliot Ness, Cleveland safety director, received a series of taunting letters allegedly from the killer directly. The letters contained details about the murders and hinted at the killer's intention. The authenticity of these letters has been subject of debate, and their connection to the actual perpetrator remains unclear. Autopsy reports. Autopsies were obviously performed on the victim's remains, providing details about the cause of death and the nature of the injuries. However, the lack of heads in some cases made positive identification challenging. Witness statements. Due to the transient nature of the victims and the seclusion of their crime scenes, there were few reliable witnesses. The lack of eyewitnesses hindered the investigation, making it difficult to gather information about the killer's identity or activities. Fingerprints and forensic technology. Forensic technology in the 1930s was not as advanced as it is today. The limited forensic evidence available, such as fingerprints, was not sufficient to identify or link suspects conclusively. Public fear and panic. The series of gruesome murders created widespread fear and panic in Cleveland. The public's heightened anxiety added to the pressure on law enforcement to solve the case. But the lack of tangible leads made progress challenging. Despite efforts by law enforcement agents and agencies, the Cleveland torso murder case remains unsolved, and the identity of the killer remains a mystery to this day. The limited evidence, lack of modern forensic technology, and the passage of time have contributed to the enduring enigma surrounding this infamous series of murders.